The bulk of all internationally traded crude oil in 2022 comes from three regions. The first is the most important, the most obvious, and the most problematic: the Persian Gulf. Before roughly 1500, the region was in the middle of everything. What global trade existed was dependent upon the lands and waters surrounding the Persian Gulf as a means of connecting the vast territories between Europe and the Far East. But the Americans were hardly the first people to find the region aggravating. In large part, the very existence of the deepwater technologies owes itself to European attempts to avoid the Middle East altogether. From the time the Portuguese were able to shoot their way into India in the early 1500s, the need to pass through or stop in the region more or less evaporated, and the entirety of the Middle East from Egypt to Persia more or less slid into strategic irrelevance. Oil changed things. The monetization of the old Zoroastrian lands made Persia matter enough to trigger British imperial attention, with the status of Persia becoming integral to war efforts in 1939 to 45. The real explosion of activity happened later, with the discovery and exploitation of oil deposits throughout territory that now comprises not just southwestern Iran, but also Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. While evolutions and manipulations, both market and military, have varied these players' individual output widely over the years, their collective output has been a fairly reliable 20 million barrels a day for the past 7 decades. As of 2021, that 20 million barrels is roughly 1/5 of global supplies and 1/2 of internationally traded crude. These 8 countries have 2 things in common. First, they are technologically incompetent, or, at the very best, criminally lazy. Their educational systems are sad jokes, and local citizens lucky enough to gain technical degrees out of region tend not to return. The locals' incompetence is hardly limited to the energy sector. These countries, as a matter of course, import millions of foreign workers to handle everything from their power systems to building construction to civic infrastructure. All 8 countries rely on outside workers, primarily from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Turkey, Algeria, and Egypt, to keep the crude flowing. The region doesn't need all of these foreign players, but each in-region country needs at least one of them. Second, as technically incompetent as these states are, they are even less competent when it comes to naval action. Few have ever domestically constructed anything more interesting than a speedboat, and in nearly all cases, not even that. Iran's navy in particular is mostly comprised of inflatable zodiacs, imported of course. None have the capacity to patrol their own coastlines, much less their trade approaches, much less the trade lanes upon which their income, their existence, depends. Every single one of them is utterly dependent upon outside powers to get every drop of their crude production to end consumers. For more than half of those exports, that means reaching the Northeast Asian states of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. For half of the remainder, it means reaching Europe or North America. The order may not have been possible without these countries' oil, but neither would these countries have been possible without the strategic overwatch of the order. The second major zone of oil production is the former Soviet space. While this region's politics and geopolitics are, if anything, louder and messier and heftier than the Persian Gulf's, the calculus of the region's oil is far simpler. The Soviet Union was a massive producer of the black stuff, but the vast majority of that output was consumed within the Soviet Empire. Things only started to get internationally interesting when the Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet industry collapsed along with it, while all the old Soviet satellites in Central Europe broke away. With Russian internal demand failing, and other former Soviet imperial demand now on the other side of international borders, the Russians had scads of spare oil output that needed to find new homes. In the first wave of post-Soviet exports, the Russians focused not simply on what they knew, but on what their infrastructure would allow. Piped exports to their former satellites, one of which was now a constituent part of a reunited Germany. The second wave expanded upon what the Russians knew. thickening and extending those pipe links through Central Europe into Western Germany, Austria, the Western Balkans, and Turkey. In implementing Wave 2, the Russians discovered that ports like Gdansk in Poland, Ventspils in Latvia, and Constanta in Romania could serve as offloading facilities for Russian crude, enabling it to sell on to customers far and wide. Phase 3 was about linking up and building out Russia's own ports to serve the same purpose. Primorsk near St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea, and Novorossiysk and Tuapse on the Black Sea. During these first 3 phases, the other former Soviet states were hardly standing still. Now divorced from their former imperial master, all needed to establish their own income streams, preferably ones that were not beholden to Moscow. Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan both courted any and all foreign investors, with BP and Exxon proving the most interested. The foreigners executed some of the most complex seismic, drilling, processing, and infrastructure programs the energy world has ever seen, and began shipping crude out via whatever route proved possible. Some routes tapped into legacy Soviet infrastructure, heading north and west to places like Ventspils or Novorossiysk. But as time ticked by, the flows were increasingly concentrated into a single pipe corridor that began at Baku, Azerbaijan, and ended at a supertanker port in the Mediterranean city of Ceyhan, Turkey. What all these options have in common is that they all flow in the general direction of Eurasia's European extremities. And since Europe was peaking demographically, there was little reason to expect European oil demand to increase ever again. Sure, the Russians were filling a larger and larger slice of that demand, but market saturation was decreasing their pricing power. The Russians hated that. So in the 4th phase, the Russians started the long, expensive process of routing fresh pipe infrastructure east to the Pacific. Problems relating to permafrost and mountains and distance abound, but if there's one thing that can be said for the Russians, they are never intimidated by size. As of 2021, there were 2 main lines in operation: a very long, very expensive, very economically questionable pipe that stretches from western Siberia to the Russian port of Nakodka on the Sea of Japan, and a far shorter spur line that delivers crude direct to the old Chinese refining hub of Daqing. Add it all up, and you're talking about 15 million barrels per day of former Soviet oil, fully 11 million barrels per day of which originates within Russia's border, of which slightly over half is exported. Easily the 2nd largest source of internationally traded crude flows on the planet. There are problems. Most of Russia's oil fields are both old and extraordinarily remote from Russia's customers. Fields in the North Caucasus are all but tapped out. Those of Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are well past their peak. And even those in western Siberia have been showing signs of diminishing returns for more than a decade. With few exceptions, Russia's newer discoveries are deeper, smaller, more technically challenging, and even farther from population centers. Russian output isn't in danger of collapsing, but maintaining output will require more infrastructure, far higher upfront costs, and ongoing technical love and care to prevent steady output declines from becoming something far worse. The Russians are no slouches when it comes to oil work, but they were out of circulation from 1940 through 2000. The techs involved came a long way in that time. Foreigners, most notably supermajor BP and services firms Halliburton and Schlumberger, are responsible for half-ish of contemporary Russia's output. Any broad-scale removal of Western firms from the mix would have catastrophic impacts upon oil production throughout the entire former Soviet space. The Ukraine war is stress-testing that theory. For their part, the Azerbaijani and Kazakh projects are far and away the world's most technically exacting. Think Kashagan. Aside from the handful of folks in the world's supermajors who designed these projects, no one on the planet can maintain them. Then there's the issue of export routes. All of the broader region's oil flows first travel by pipe, in some cases for literally thousands of miles, before they reach either a customer or a discharge port. Pipes can't dodge. Anything that impedes a single inch of pipe shuts the whole thing down. That's fine and dandy. Post-order? Not so much. About half the flows terminate in end users like Germany, while the other half must be loaded on tankers for sale. That's where things get extra dicey. In the Pacific, the Nakodka port sits smack in the middle of the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean spheres of influence. Any meaningful conflict involving any of the three, and Nakodka either becomes occupied or a crater. Or, more likely, occupied and then a crater. Out to the west, exports via the Black Sea ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse are fully dependent upon sales through downtown Istanbul, so any hiccup in relations with the Turks kills a couple million barrels of daily flows. Farther north, anything out of Primorsk has to sail the Baltic Sea and the Skagerrak Strait, sailing by no fewer than 7 navally over-capable to their size countries that tend to nurse pathological fears and hatreds toward all things Russian, in addition to Germany, in addition to the United Kingdom. Even if that were not enough, there's one more complicating factor. Siberia, despite getting cold enough to literally freeze your nose off in October, doesn't get cold enough. Most Russian oil production is in the permafrost, and for most of the summer, the permafrost is inaccessible because its top layer melts into a messy, horizon-spanning swamp. Tapping oil here requires waiting for the land to freeze, building dike roads across the wasteland, and drilling in the Siberian winter. Should something happen to consumption of Russian crude, flows back up through the literally thousands of miles of pipes right to the drill site. Should exports fail, whether due to a war far away, a war on Russia, or a war by Russia, there is but one mitigation: shut it all down. Turning production back on would require manually checking everything, all the way from the well to the border. The last time this happened was the Soviet collapse in 1989. 33 years on, Russia still hasn't gotten back to its Cold War production levels. Only during the oil-ravenous stability of the post-Cold War period of the American-led order is the current iteration of Russia's internationalized oil complex even possible. And with the Ukraine war, it is already over. The third and final major source of global crude is within North America. A lot of oil output on the continent falls into the general category of legacy, in regions that have been producing for upwards of a century. The first Mexican production dates all the way back to the 1920s and has been supplying Mexico with everything it needs and more ever since. In recent years, many of Mexico's large, old fields have been giving up the ghost. In part, the reason is geology, but at least as important is Mexican state policy, which often bars foreign capital, expertise, and technology from playing much of a role at all. For decades, even North Korea had less stringent investment laws on its energy sector. Left to their own devices, the Mexicans are proving incapable at keeping their old fields on life support and exploiting newer discoveries either on or offshore. Even with this glaring weakness, Mexico's oil needs are roughly in balance. It exports some crude to the United States and then imports a similar volume of refined product. On balance, Mexico produces and uses about 2 million barrels per day. Up north, the Canadian oil sector got its start in the 1950s, becoming globally significant in the 1970s. But it wasn't until the 1980s that the province of Alberta started cracking the code on some seriously unconventional output. Traditionally, oil migrates through rock formations until it reaches an impermeable rock layer. For example, the crude might migrate through sandstone, but granite would stop it cold. Pressure then builds behind the impermeable layer. When a drill punches through the cap, the pressure and oil are released. Most of Alberta's oil is nothing like that. Instead of big pressurized liquid pools of crude locked behind tough rock, Alberta's oil is diffused through far softer rock, functionally integrated into the rock's matrix in solid form. Getting it out requires either injecting steam into the formation to melt the oil out, or mining it and washing the oil out with hot water. From there, this ultra-thick crude oil must be mixed with lighter crude grades to thin it so it can be pumped via conventional pipeline. No matter how it is measured, Canada produces far more than it could ever use. It consumes a similar amount to Mexico, but exports that much again. Almost all of Alberta's oil sands production is shipped south to the United States, mostly for processing in Texas. In the continent's middle latitudes, the Americans have a lot going on. They have a legacy offshore sector in the Gulf of Mexico that didn't really get going until the 1970s. There is still conventional crude trickling out of Pennsylvania and Texas in places that have been producing oil longer than any other spots on the planet. Even California was among the country's largest oil producers until quite recently, with one of the country's most prolific wells located in a mall on Wilshire Boulevard, while another is cleverly disguised as a synagogue. Taken together, the American conventional oil legacy remains substantial, still kicking out about 4 million barrels per day, a volume that compares favorably to Iran at its 1970s height, and is about the same as the total output from Canada today. But the real story is the new stuff, America's shale oil sector. Back in the early 2000s, the world of oil got slammed by 4 simultaneous and unrelated events. First, the US subprime build was already getting out of hand, generating unhealthy levels of demand for all the things that go into home construction: lumber, concrete, copper, steel, and oil. Second, the Chinese boom was getting a touch insane. Price-insensitive demand drove up the price of all globally available commodities, oil included. Third, in 2002, a very unsuccessful coup in Venezuela led to a very successful political purge of the country's state oil firm, a purge that focused on the technocrats who produced the oil. The country's energy sector never recovered. Fourth, in 2003, the Americans invaded Iraq, taking all its oil output offline. The country didn't return to pre-war levels of output for 16 years. Between higher demand and lower supplies, oil prices steadily climbed from below $10 a barrel in 1998 to nearly $150 a barrel in 2008. When your work earns you $10, you tend to stick to the tried and true. When your work earns you $150, you can afford to try all kinds of things. With a few years of experimentation, the collective American energy complex was able to crack the code on something we now call the shale revolution. In essence, shale operators drill down as per normal, but when they reach a petroleum-rich rock strata, they take a sharp turn, drilling horizontally along the entire layer. They then pump water and sand at high pressure into the formation. Since liquids do not compress, the rock cracks apart from within, freeing untold trillions of tiny pockets of oil and natural gas that would otherwise be far too small to harvest with conventional drilling. The sand suspended in the frac fluid props the cracks open, while the now freed oil provides reverse pressure that pushes the water back up the pipe. Once the water has cleared, the oil continues flowing. Voila! A shale well is born.